So welcome to you joining us online. Welcome to those of you here. We are going to begin with the opening prayer for Unit 7, or excuse me, Unit 6. Getting ahead of myself here already. And page 19 in your student question book. Lord of creation, time, and eternity, we praise you for revealing your gracious and forgiving heart through your written and living word. As we ponder the lives of your Old Testament people, help us to see ourselves as you see us. They were sinful, and so are we. They were called and saved by divine grace, and so are we. As we learn more about the rise and fall of human empires, help us to understand that in Jesus, your eternal kingdom broke into this earthly realm. Empower us through your Holy Spirit to walk through life out of step with the world, but in step with your Son, the crucified, risen, and ever-present Jesus, the Messiah. We pray in his forgiving name. Amen. Okay, so as we do the summary points from the last lesson, that's on page 78 in your text. Let me pull up these lessons here and hide the stuff that gets in the way. And then we'll review from lesson 5. If someone would be so kind as to read 5A.
Genesis 1 outlines how, as the human family grew, God's focus of attention eventually centered on Abraham and Sarah, the first of a community that became known as the chosen people. God did not call them because of what he saw in them. He called them because of what he planned to accomplish through them. He did not choose them for a special privilege. He chose them for a special mission.
And so those contrasts would be important to remember, right? Not what he saw in them, but what he planned to do through them. Chosen not because they were special and they deserved privileges, but he chose them for a special purpose and a special mission. So any questions on 5A? It's kind of that odd combination of multiple pictures. So let's go on to 5B.
Genesis reveals details about a complex family tree. The line of the chosen people did not always flow through the firstborn. It went through Isaac, not Ishmael, and through Jacob, not Esau. The Genesis narrative also includes 7 nations, 6 of which had genetic links to Abraham, which the Israelites eventually viewed with disdain. The Canaanites, the Midianites, the Moabites, the Ammonites, Ammonites,
There you go.
Ishmaelites, Edomites, and Amalekites. Boy.
Yeah.
The Canaanites were descendants of Noah's grandson Canaan and were looked on as a cursed people.
All right, so we'll actually spend some time with all of those in the unit, and we'll see a expanded family tree similar to this picture. Any questions on that? One thing that might be kind of fun to note, because I don't think we mentioned this, is where it says that the line did not always flow through the firstborn. That's significant. In part, kind of gives us a hint that what God is up to may not be what people are used to, or what the wider world might expect. Okay, 5C.
Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3 describes God making a covenant with Abraham, a one-way covenant of divine commitment in which God told Abraham to go to the land of Canaan, which he would eventually give to Abraham and his descendants, that he would make out of Abraham a great and numerous people, that he would use him and his descendants to bring blessings to the nations of the world.
Thank you. Covenant of divine commitment. We're going to spend time with that in Unit 8, so hang on to that. But we see this covenant, and that's going to play an important role. So here, this picture symbolizes that again. You have that elongated, extended arrow from God. because God is the one making the covenant. Abraham, hands on hips. He's not party to creating that, even though the covenant obviously will be directed to him and to his descendants. So we'll want to remember that as well. And then finally, 5D, which doesn't have a picture that goes with it.
The narrative describing the life of Abraham and Sarah is detailed and complex. Although God had promised Abraham numerous offspring at the end of his life, the chosen people consisted of Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, and Jacob. At times, Genesis describes the behavior of Abraham and Sarah as not exactly saintly, and it raises the question, in what way were they to be a source of blessing to the nations? Although God promised to give the land of Canaan to Abraham and his descendants, at the close of his life, Abraham owned only a field and a burial cave beyond its borders, which he purchased. Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Leah were eventually buried in that cave.
Okay, thank you. This little paragraph reminds me that if this is the first time you will have done sort of an in-depth study of this nature, don't get too discouraged that some of the little, and I don't mean this disrespectfully, but the simplified Sunday school structures kind of collapse. And because we're going to find that a lot of the people we will read about, including those who are part of the chosen people, they're not great examples, right? Later on, when we get to studying David as an example, any of us who have daughters would say, my daughter came home saying, "Hey, Dad, I found a man just like David I want to marry. We're going to worry about it." Okay, so it's not a but don't worry, as some of those insufficient foundations get shook up a little bit, I think you'll find that a firmer foundation comes out of that. So just reference that, because it mentions here that, you know, his family acts anything like a saint. Yeah, that's going to show up a lot as we journey through this, because over and over again, the only hero in the Bible is God. Everybody else, we're going to have to deal with the fallibility of us human beings. And as hard as that can be sometimes, it gives us hope that obviously as we look at our own lives or at the life of in the world that we live today, and find that hope. So any questions on Unit 5? That kind of took us the first basically half of Genesis. In this unit today, we're going to cover the rest, okay? So Unit 6, entitled The World of the Patriarchs. And again, referencing, right, it starts out the frailties and the fortunes of Abraham's offspring. And what we're going to do today is look at the illustrations first, and then we'll set those aside and journey both through the text of the Bible, but also those nice little summary paragraphs that you have starting on page 84. But let's get ourselves there with this split picture. All right, and we'll start with the top. Fertile Crescent. You see those words written here? Why is it called the Fertile Crescent?
Because of the rivers that overflow.
Yep, the rivers, and you can kind of see the green, right? What you see not green is wilderness. Now, it takes a little bit of practice, because we used to, another word that gets used is desert, but I don't know about you, where I grew up in Southern California, when I think of desert, I think of sand and sand dunes. And that's certainly a type of desert, but not all deserts are like that. If you've ever done traveling in Arizona or states like that, it's just dry, kind of desolate, not lots of stuff, but not necessarily tons of sand or sand dunes. And so, yeah, this is fertile, and look at its shape as well, right? You can kind of see the curve that's happening here. So this is the Fertile Crescent, and two rivers that we generally don't have trouble pronouncing because we've heard them before. The Tigris, which isn't that weird of a spelling, but the Euphrates, that's a different kind of spelling. And yet in between, that land is referred to, as your text points out, Mesopotamia, which is just a word that combines two words which mean between the rivers. So if you remember back to your history classes in grade school, junior high, high school, may have talked about some of these places. We're going to fill in some pictures and arrows as we go, and we're going to look at some of these names of places like Beersheba, Mamre, Bethel, Shechem. We've run into some of those already in the Abraham story. We'll come to them again. Down here in this bottom left corner, you see a pyramid. That's always going to be the symbol for Egypt. And then interestingly enough, here over in the right-hand side, you see a couple different versions of what's called a ziggurat. And we'll fill in where some of those are, but a ziggurat is essentially an artificial mountain. Okay. And so that's shaped differently than the pyramids are, which by and large are tombs. The ziggurats would be places where the ancient people would hold worship services. So we look at the next part of the picture, you see an arrow show up from goes up to Haran or Haran, depending on how you want to pronounce that. And so we are told that Abram and his family were originally from They moved to Haran, and then from Haran, they came down into Canaan. And we'll see a couple of times how they go down into Egypt and back up. So there's going to be this movement, but all of it following the fact that you've got, this is the way you travel because of the need to have water available. Okay. And then we'll put in some ziggurats. Look at them all. None of them showing there except the two big ones. Look at them all. I mean, there were just dozens of them all over artificial mountains upon which they would worship. Okay. The other thing that's sort of interesting, we don't hear about it in the Bible itself. Point number 4 on the top of page 81 lists this city of Nuzi. And as they referenced, there was some significant archaeological discoveries that really help shine the light on what we read about in Genesis in particular, and Exodus to some degree. And there was even a stretch for a while where scholars believed that the stories of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph were just kind of fabrications because there wasn't a lot of other evidence to show things. But in Nuzi and other places, when archaeologists dug up and discovered different things, there was a lot of corroboration. And so what's really fascinating, by and large, archaeology has never disproven things that we find in the Bible. It often has things that support that. So it is kind of fascinating that way. Okay. Questions on this upper picture? It's really just kind of setting the stage for us there. Well, let's go down below. You guys remember what this is right here?
Abraham's plotted land.
Yeah. Abraham bought the field. He wanted the cave. We saw that in Genesis 23. He wanted the cave, but in order to get the cave, he had to buy the field, package deal, right? So this is what they owned in the promised land. And so we'll see that, but here comes that arrow down, and then we're going to run into, see if I can get this, they'll go down into Egypt. Abraham does that, remember, passes Sarah off as his sister. And then all of these people, and we're going to spend some time reading more about these, but I think what happens next in your pictures is they kind of get highlighted, right? So you got the Canaanites, don't like the Canaanites. You got the Ammonites and the Moabites, even though they're sort of cousins, they don't like them. The Edomites, Jacob's descendants were the Israelites. Esau's descendants were the Edomites. And maybe, hopefully not going too far down a rabbit hole or too deep into the weeds, but by and large, language is communicated through consonants, not through vowels. In fact, if you want to experiment with this sometime, just write out a sentence, right? The boy went to the store. Or what's the one that you did in typing? A quick brown fox jumps over or lazy dog, or something like that. I don't remember exactly what it was. But if you write out those sentences, scrunch them all together, get rid of all the space in between, then one time eliminate the consonants and just write the vowels. And you will look at that sentence and go, I have absolutely no idea what that means. And then do the same thing with just the consonants. And it may not be super easy to do, but you can see it much more clearly. Why do I mention that? So we have the Edomites, and so you see the D and the M, and of course, ites, remember, people of. In New Testament, this area is going to be Idumea, Idumea. Well, you got the D and you got the M. And Herod the Great, that's the king who was alive when Jesus was born, and the king who met with the Magi, the wise men, the king who slaughtered the children. Herod the Great was an Idumean. So his descendants was through the Esau side of the equation, not the Jacob side of the equation. So that's part of the reason he was considered to be a pretender to the throne as the king of the Jews. Because he came from the wrong branch of the family. And so that's kind of interesting. But the Edomites, even though they were cousins, we'll look at some of this a little bit more. Then you got the Ishmaelites. Those are through Ishmael rather than Isaac. You've got the Midianites. We read about those in chapter 25 when, again, for some of us, surprisingly discovered that after Sarah died, Abraham remarried and had buckets of kids, right? The old guy still got it, right? Sort of a thing. And Midian is one of those children. And then the Amalekites or the Amalekites, whichever way you like to say it, we're going to see as we follow along that these people were highly looked at with high grades of disfavor, dislike, even hatred or despising or loathing. Strong words to use. But these 7 nations will show up, and sometimes that the 7 isn't always exactly the same, because surprise, surprise, we'll come across another group of people that you've heard of called the Philistines. Right? They're not particularly cared for either in the story, but he references in here how when Jesus fed the 4,000 in Gentile territory, there were 7 baskets left over. Whereas when Jesus fed the 5,000 in Jewish territory, there were 12 baskets left over. And the Bible doesn't come right out specifically to say it, but many see that connection. 12, right? The 12 tribes of Israel, the 12 apostles, that kind of sense for, that's a Jewish number, and 7 is this Gentile number. And so it's kind of interesting. We'll pick up on some of these things, right? And then, of course, eventually in this land of Goshen, by the time we get to the end of the narrative in Genesis, this is where the Israelites are going to be. They're not in the land of Canaan. They've got only that little piece of property in the land of Canaan, but they're living down in Goshen in Egypt. And by the end of our unit today, we will see how that appears to be a very happy location. But when you flip the page to go into Exodus, which is what we'll look at in a subsequent lesson, not such a happy circumstance. But we're just sort of following along, okay? So that's what's going on in this picture. It's just sort of setting a stage for us to get a little sense of things. Questions on that? The pictures today are not super complicated or in-depth, but they do have a lot of information. We'll go to the next one. Illustration 6b, another family tree that takes us in a couple of direction. So we're kind of tracing it down this time from Noah. He has 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Ham is the one who has Canaan. Canaan gets cursed. But then you start journeying through this list of descendants, and you get down to Terah, who is the father of Abraham, Nahor, and Haran. And Haran is the son who has Lot. And so here's your kind of your breakdown. We'll just do Abraham. So Abraham has Ishmael, Abraham has Isaac, Abraham has Midian, and then those other sons that we read about in Genesis 25. But these are the ones we'll come across. You have Nahor, who has Bethuel, who will be the father of Rebekah, who will be the one to marry Isaac. Kind of what's going on here. Interestingly enough, Haran has a daughter, so this is Lot's sister, Milcah, who will marry her uncle. This is this bloodline relations, right? And we'll have Lot, and it's out of Lot we get the Moabites and the Ammonites. Bethuel will have Laban, that's Rebekah's brother. He's the one that Jacob has to deal with to get his wife. We'll kind of follow that through. But Isaac and Rebekah in their marriage will have Esau and Jacob. Esau is where you get the Edomites from, and Edom has to do something with the color red. And it is he's the one who sold his birthright for a pot of stew, that kind of thing. But then, so Rebekah, then Laban, her brother, has 2 daughters, Rachel and Leah, and those are ones that Jacob will marry. He wants Rachel, he gets Leah, then he gets Rachel eventually, and of course he'll get their maids. You've got Bilhah and Zilpah, so it starts to be really complicated, confusing. Again, once more, has Hollywood has nothing on Genesis for the soap operas and the stories that play out. I mean, it's all there. But by the time we get in and through the story, it's through Jacob and the 2 wives, Rachel and Leah, and their maids, Bilhah and Zilpah, that you get the 12 of Joseph, Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Gad, and Asher. And then there's one daughter that's spoken about, that's Dinah, although the text will sometimes refer to Jacob's sons and daughters, so there's the sense that there's more, but she's the only named daughter. And it's these become your Israelites. And of course, Joseph himself will have Ephraim and Manasseh. And it just not a spoiler alert, but the tribe of Levi will be the priestly Levitical tribe. And so they kind of get pulled out of the equation. And then Joseph, so instead of Joseph with 1 descendant, you have 2. So then Ephraim and Manasseh get stuck in here. So your 12 are often 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, skip that one, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. That's kind of how you count through it, but it gets confusing after a while.
Which one is Jesus? From Judah.
Right. And so it's interesting. And this is something you're going to follow through as well. Thank you for the question. That even though we go, even though Jacob is the favored son, Joseph, son number 11, is a favored son. The holy history will go through Judah. And there's some unsavory stuff in here, right? Judah gets his own daughter-in-law. She fools him. We'll look at some of these, but Jesus's quote unquote family tree is anything but clean, purebred, always holy, behaving right. I mean, it's again, even in the genealogy of Jesus, you see him being there on behalf of the broken, being there on behalf of the sinful. So that pattern will continue through the story. again, biblically, you're living in this is the word they sometimes use, living in a patriarchal time. And so much more attention is given historically to men than to women. But it's amazing as we read through the Bible story how often women are popping up in key roles. Again, another hint of some things to come. So, but the women, as you can see, are in yellow, and there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of them listed here. Okay. Those are our illustrations. We'll come back to a couple things, and if we have time at the end, we will look at our timeline as well and give you a little bit of a journey through that as well. But let's open up both to page 84 and to Genesis 25. Now we have 25 and a half chapters that we're covering, so we're not going to get to read all of them verse by verse. I've said to you before that the headings that are listed in the Bible, and sometimes those headings are right in the text itself, often in bold print. Sometimes they're at the top, sometimes they're at the bottom. Those headings are not the Bible, they're not part of the biblical text, but they are there for trying to give us some help in what is coming. So we're going to actually use those a little bit. But we essentially ended last time with Abraham's death in verses 7 through 11 of Genesis 25. And now the story will continue to move on. And it first moves on by describing Ishmael and his descendants. Ishmael, as you might remember, was described as being a wild ass of a man or a wild donkey of a man. I heard someone once say Ishmael had all of the gentleness of a kicking donkey. So, but you have a list of people who are in here, and they will show up in the story from time to time. But now let's go ahead and somebody read Exodus 25, 19 through 28.
Exodus.
Thank you. Not Exodus, Genesis. How could I mispronounce my favorite book? I just did it.
This is the account of the family Isaac, the son of Abraham. When Isaac was 40 years old, he married Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel, the Aramean of Pandaram, the sister of Laban, the Aramean.
So you got a little bit of the pedigree there, right? Keep going.
Isaac pleaded with the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was unable to have children. The Lord answered Isaac's prayer, and Rebekah became pregnant with twins. But the two children struggled with each other in her womb, so she went and asked the Lord about it. "Why is this happening to me?" she asked. And the Lord told her, "The sons in your womb will become two nations. From the very beginning, the two nations will be rivals. One nation will be stronger than the other. Your older son will serve your younger son." And when the time came to give birth, Rebekah discovered that she did indeed have twins. The first one was very red at birth and covered with thick hair like a fur coat, so they named him Esau. Then the other twin was born, and his hand grasped Esau's heel, so they named him Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when the twins were born.
Okay. So you've got Isaac being described in verse 20 as what age? 40. And in verse 28, verse 26, 60. So 20 years of barrenness. Now we heard a lot more about Sarah's barrenness. Here it's just compressed, but you have that theme recurring. You also have twins in this instance, and it makes you think back, they're never described as twins, but you had Cain and Abel mentioned early on, so kind of two brothers. And here you get a little bit about names and some of those connections there. And Jacob, you've got a footnote probably for his name and a description of what his name means. And in short, colloquial English, cheater is what his name means. Right? And it's he was holding a hold of his brother's foot as they were being pulled out. You get this sense that he was going to be working his way up the body to try and get out first, but he didn't quite get that far, right? Yeah. So anyway, and of course Esau's a hairy man. That's going to play into the story later. And then really quickly, the last two verses that you can just read with your eyes. We fast forward again now. We got their births, and now they're grown up. Just like that. For verse 26, they're just babies. And in verse 27, they're grown. So the Bible will sometimes, they sometimes use the word telescope or compress. Sometimes the Bible will have lots of information, and sometimes just, and we'll get the same thing with Jesus, right? We have Jesus's birth, and maybe the first couple of years, if you take Matthew's gospel and the fact that Herod tried to kill all the babies 2 years old and under, you kind of got that little bit of a window there. But then we got that one story of Jesus in the temple, and then next time he shows up as a grown-up. So it's not it's not without precedent that it doesn't always answer our questions. You also, verse 28, get told something about the family dynamics. So if your family was like that, or you've heard about families like that, don't think yourself unique. Parents sometimes do indeed play favorites. And here's the first little step. Somebody take 29 through the end of the chapter.
Once when Jacob was cooking a stew, Esau came in from the field and he was famished. Esau said to Jacob, "Let me eat some of that red stuff, for I am famished." Therefore he was called Edom. Jacob said, "First sell me your birthright." Esau said, "I am about to die. Of what use is a birthright to me?" Jacob said, "Swear to me first." So he swore to him and sold his birthright to Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau bread and lentil stew, and he ate and drank and rose and went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright.
All right, so there's already some of this scheming that's going on, right? And the whole idea of bread. Then we have a little detour that will probably sound somewhat familiar to you, because you have a famine, and Isaac goes off to Gerar, to Abimelech, king of the Philistines, and it's going to stay there because they don't have provision in the land that he's been sojourning in. And he's told not to go to Egypt, right? In verse 2. And we get this promise of the offspring being as numerous as the stars of heaven in verse 4. So we got some repetition, and yet he says to his wife, "Tell them you're my sister," right? They're cousins. But, and so yet again, one of the chosen wives, we'll call them, are so delightful to some foreign ruler that he brings her into his harem, right? Because he's afraid he's going to die. And yet they noticed that he was fiddling around a little bit and thought, what the heck is going on here? And proved to be another what? Deception, huh? Abimelech says, verse 10, what is this you've done? One of the people might easily have lain with your wife, and you would have brought guilt on us. So he warned all the people, whoever touches this man or his wife shall be put to death. And then, interestingly enough, when we hear about Abram and Sarah doing this, they just leave, but Isaac hangs around for a while and grows some crops, and they start to become battling over water rights, and so you've got already this early struggle between the Philistines and those who will eventually become to known as the Israelites. They aren't that yet.
This
But-
is the first time the Philistines is.
It's the first time they're mentioned. Yeah. Well, there's a reference to them earlier on in a listing, but this is, yeah, where they start to show up as a group, right? So you've got battling over water, and verse 16, even Abimelech said to Isaac, go away from us. You've become too powerful for us. So somebody start reading verses 17 through 22.
So Isaac departed from there and camped in the valley of Gerar and settled there. Isaac dug again the wells of water that had been dug in the days of his father Abraham, for the Philistines had stopped them up after the death of Abraham, and he gave them the names that his father had given them. But when Isaac's servants dug in the valley and found there a well of spring water, the herds of Gerar quarreled with Isaac's herdsmen, saying, the water is ours. So he called the well Esek, because they contended with him. Then they dug another well, and they quarreled over that one also. So he called it Sitnah. He moved from there and dug another well, and they did not quarrel over it. So he called it Rehoboth, saying, now the Lord has made room for us, and we shall be fruitful in this land.
So you have names of places kind of telling a story, right? You look at your footnotes. Isek means contention. Sitna means enmity. Rehoboth means lots of room. So, and then we get Beersheba, and that showed up on our little map. And somebody read 23, 24, 25.
From there he went up to Beersheba, and that very night the Lord appeared to him and said, I am the God of your father Abraham. Do not be afraid, for I am with you and will bless you and make your offspring numerous for my servant Abraham's sake. So he built an altar there, called on the name of the Lord, and pitched his tent there, and there Isaac's servants dug a well.
All right, so here's this repetition of the promise. This is going to occur numerous times. And now Abimelech shows back up. Keep going, Polly. Finish 26 through 33.
Then Abimelech went to him from Gerar with Ahuzah, his advisor, and Phicol, the commander of his army. Isaac said to them, why then have you come to me, seeing that you hate me and have sent me away from you? They said, we see plainly that the Lord has been with you. So we say, let there be an oath between you and us, and let us make a covenant with you, so that you will do us no harm, just as we have not touched you and have done to you nothing but good, and have sent you away in peace. You are now the blessed of the Lord. So he made them a feast. He made them a feast, and they ate and drank. In the morning they rose early and exchanged oaths, and Isaac set them on their way, and they departed from him in peace. That same day Isaac's servants came and told him about the well that they had dug, and said to him, we have found water. He called it Shibah. Therefore the name of the city is Beersheba to this day.
Okay. So that's a place that shows up. So here you have the king identifying that Isaac is blessed, and he wants to enter into a covenant relationship with him. And we'll see that a lot of people in that part of the world, even still today, those covenants and those agreements that get made, for the sake of harmony and unity, that nobody's going to rise up to fight against somebody else. That's an important practice. And we even talk about, I mean, right, the people who live next to us are called our neighbors. But when someone behaves in a kind way, we say they are neighborly, right? And so there's this idea that you ought to be at peace with the people who are living around you, right? And that a community is built, and healthy communities or healthy churches or healthy families when you've got these sort of relationships in place. So that's some of the stuff that's playing out here. Again, remember that the paragraph, or not the paragraphs, but the chapters and the verses were added later, so they're not always necessarily in the right space, because at the end of this delightful little story, you got 2 verses about Esau getting married, and Mama and Papa not too excited about that, which sets us up for the next chapter. So you've got Esau at the end of 26 marrying 2 women, 2 local girls. And mom and dad aren't happy. And so what comes next is a story that not only has to do with Isaac blessing Jacob, who steals that birthright, but Isaac also sending Jacob off, as we'll see here in a little bit. That's kind of the stories that are coming. So somebody read chapter 27, do your best speed reading, and get through verse 17. Go ahead, Lori.
When Isaac was old and his eyes were dim so that he could not see, he called his elder son Esau and said to him, "My son." And he answered, "Here I am." He said, "See, I am old. I do not know the day of my death. Now then, take your weapons, your quiver and your bow, and go out to the field and hunt game for me. Then prepare for me savory food such as I like, and bring it to me to eat, so that I may bless you before I die." Now Rebekah was listening when Isaac spoke to his son Esau. So when Esau went to the field to hunt for game and bring it, Rebekah said to her son Jacob, "I heard your father say to your brother Esau, 'Bring me game and prepare for me savory food to eat, that I may bless you before the Lord before I die.' Now therefore, my son, obey my words as I command you. Go to the flock and get me 2 choice kids, so that I may prepare from them savory food for your father, such as he likes. And you shall take it to your father to eat, so that he may bless you before he dies." But Jacob said to his mother Rebekah, "Look, my brother Esau is a hairy man, and I am a man of smooth skin. Perhaps my father will feel me, and I shall seem to be mocking him and bring a curse on myself and not a blessing." His mother said to him, "Let your curse be on me, my son. Only obey my word and go get them for me." So he went and got them and brought them to his mother, and his mother prepared savory food such as his father loved. Then Rebekah took the best garments of her elder son Esau, which were with her in the house, and put them on her younger son Jacob. And she put the skins of the kids on his hands and on the smooth part of his neck. Then she handed the savory food and the bread that she had prepared to her son Jacob.
All right. So the intrigue, shall we say, is beginning. By the way, it references in verse 15 house. So sometimes the language is there, we're thinking tent, because they're dwelling in places rather than farming necessarily where you would have permanence. But what's going on? Isaac wants to pass the blessing on to Esau. Rebekah wants the blessing to go to Jacob. And remember, Jacob has already, quote unquote, stolen, or he's already Jacobed his brother's birthright. And now something is coming. Rebekah's doing some scheming, and she says, we got to get you to get the birthright. And he's not so hot on the idea, right? Keep going, Lori.
So he went into his father and said, my father, and he said, here I am, who are you, my son? Jacob said to his father, I am Esau, your firstborn. I have done as you told me. Now sit up and eat of my game so that you may bless me. But Isaac said to his son, how is it that you have found it so quickly, my son? He answered, because the Lord your God granted me success. Then Isaac said to Jacob, come near, that I may feel you, my son, to know whether you are really my son Esau or not. So Jacob went up to his father Isaac, who felt him and said, the voice is Jacob's voice, but the hands are the hands of Esau. He did not recognize him because his hands were hairy like his brother Esau's hands, so he blessed him. He said, are you really my son Esau? He answered, I am. Then he said, bring it to me that I may eat of my son's game and bless you. So he brought it to him and he ate, and he brought him wine and he drank. Then his father Isaac said to him, come near and kiss me, my son. So he came near and kissed him, and he smelled the smell of his garments and blessed him and said, ah, the smell of my son is like the smell of a field that the Lord has blessed. May God give you of the dew of heaven and of the fatness of the earth and plenty of grain and wine. Let peoples serve you and nations bow down to you. Be Lord over your brothers, and may your mother's sons bow down to you. Cursed be everyone who curses you, and blessed be everyone who blesses you.
So Dad isn't quite sure and feels the fur from the goats, right? I mean, Esau was hairy if you use a goat, and wow, that's a lot of hair, right? And then the smell, it's still not all clicking, but ultimately the blessing is spoken. And Jacob leaves. And as soon as he leaves, Esau comes, right? Somebody pick up from there, verse 30 through 30, or through 40.
As soon as Isaac had finished blessing Jacob, and almost before Jacob had left his father, Esau returned from his hunt. Esau prepared a delicious meal and brought it to his father. Then he said, sit up, my father, and eat my wild game so you can give me your blessing. But Isaac asked him, who are you? Isaac replied, it is your son, your firstborn son, Esau. Isaac began to tremble uncontrollably and said, then who had just served me wild game? I have already eaten it, and I blessed him just before you came. And yes, that blessing must stand. When Esau heard his father's words, he let out a loud and bitter cry. Oh, my father, what about me? Bless me too, he begged. But Isaac said, your brother was here, and he tricked me. He has taken away your blessing. Esau exclaimed, no wonder his name is Jacob. For now he has cheated me twice. First, he took my rights as firstborn, and now he has stolen my blessing. Oh, haven't you saved even one blessing for me? Isaac said to Esau, I have made Jacob your master and have declared that all his brothers will be his servants. He had guaranteed him an abundance of grain and wine, yet what is left for me to give you, my son? Esau pleaded, but do you have only one blessing? Oh, my father, bless me too. Then Esau broke down and wept. Finally, his father Isaac said to him, you will live away from the richness of the earth and away from the dew of the heaven above. You will live by your sword and you will serve your brother. But when you decide to break free, you will shake his yoke from your neck.
Okay. And then verse 41, Esau hated Jacob. So whatever family harmony there may have been, by this point in the story, it has gotten bad. Some people sometimes ask, well, why couldn't Jacob have just blessed Esau too, or said, well, you know what, I take the blessing back and I give it to you instead. And in the Bible, not just ancient, in the Bible, understanding of words is different perhaps than sometimes we have. You can't take it back. Words are like, bad example, but words are like pulling the trigger on a gun. Once that bullet goes out, you can't pull it back. It's shot, it's gone, it's carried forth to do what it is designed to do. And that's why, for example, in verse 33, he says, you know, what happened? I'm your firstborn. And he trembles quite a bit. And he said, I have blessed him. Yes, and blessed he shall be, because he's spoken the word of blessing on there. And this is where this animosity between Esau and Jacob becomes so great again. Rebekah hears this, so she's going to make plans to get Jacob out of there. And she's going to send him off to her brother way back up in Haran, and it's going to stay there. It ends, verse 46 says, Rebekah said to Isaac, I'm weary of my life because of the Hittite women. Now, the Hittite women are the ones, and this is where they, the references crisscross, right? But back at the end of 26, you've got Esau marrying these Hittite women, and Jacob and Isaac and Rebekah are not happy with it. So she says, you know, I'm weary of these. If Jacob marries one of them, what good will my life be to me, right? And as is still sometimes the case, if Mama Bear wants something, Papa Bear makes sure it happens. And so this is when Isaac calls Jacob and sends him off. Remember, that same kind of thing occurred with Abraham wanting to get a wife for Isaac. And so we're going to marry within the bloodline. I'll read chapter 28, this part. Isaac called Jacob, blessed him, and charged him, you shall not marry one of the Canaanite women. Go at once to Padan Aram, to the house of Bethuel, your mother's father, and take a wife from there, one of the daughters of Laban, your mother's brother. May God Almighty bless you and make you fruitful and numerous, that you may become a company of peoples. May he give to you the blessing of Abraham and to your offspring with you, so that you may take possession of the land where you now live as an alien, land that God gave to Abraham. Thus Isaac sent Jacob away, and he went to Padan Aram, to Laban, son of Bethuel the Aramean, the brother of Rebekah, Jacob and Esau's mother, right? So you get a lot of these family, you know, trying to specify exactly who this is. And what does Esau do? Yeah. He goes, oh, okay. He doesn't like these Canaanite women, so I'm going to marry one anyway. So he marries, this time, a daughter of Ishmael. He had already married 2 Canaanites, so now he's marrying one of the Ishmaelites, who's not a Canaanite. Chapter 10, verse 10 through the rest of the chapter. Somebody read that, please.
Jacob left Beersheba and went toward Haran. He came to a certain place and stayed there for the night, because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones of the place, he put it under his head and lay down in that place. And he dreamed that there was a ladder sent up from the earth. The top of it reached to heaven, and the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And the Lord stood beside him and said, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham, your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie, I will give you, and give to you and to your offspring. And your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south. And all the families of the earth shall be blessed in you and in your offspring. Know that I am with you and will keep you wherever you go, and will bring you back to this land. For I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. And Jacob woke from his sleep and said, surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it. And he was afraid and said, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven.
Okay, I'll stop. Oh, go ahead and finish up.
So Jacob rose early in the morning and he took the stone that he had put under his head and set it up for a pillar and poured oil on the top of it. He called the place Bethel, but the name of the city was Luz at the first. Then Jacob made a vow, saying, if God will be with me and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God. And this stone which I have set up for a pillar shall be God's house, and of all that you give me, I will surely give 1/10 to you.
So notice Bible people will sometimes try to bargain with God, right? Even though that's not what we're called to do. So this dream at Bethel, Jacob's ladder, right? Maybe you got a Sunday school song going through your head at this time. But what occurs in verses 13 and following is a repetition of the promise. Very similar to what we heard before. And the primary difference is it was simply God saying to Abraham, and then I am the God of your father Abraham, who speaks to Isaac, and now I'm the God of your grandfather Abraham, your father Isaac, who's speaking to you. We get that Abraham, Isaac, and of course, eventually the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. That will play itself out. But the promise is repeated in what we've heard before. And what's interestingly enough is that he takes the stone that he laid his head on and stands it up as a pillar. We'll see that occurring. And this very stone, or at least the thought of it, will show up in the New Testament. So should I just leave that cliffhanger hanging, or should I tell you a little more?
Tell me more.
Okay, so we'll learn as we get kind of going ahead here a little bit that the Ark of the Covenant will be in the center of their lives, in the tabernacle, which they camp around. And that becomes kind of that central place. Well, the Ark of the Covenant will be lost after many centuries when the Babylonians come and sack Jerusalem. So when they rebuild the temple, there is no Ark anymore. But what they put in the Holy of Holies is this stone that is there. And so we'll hang on to that, but that stone is in the Holy of Holies in the Jerusalem temple that's up Herod's temple when Jesus is doing his ministry. So
Same stone?
that's
Dated stone?
well, that's the idea. Like I say, this stone or the idea of this stone will be there, right? So it's but the very fact of standing up a stone as a pillar or a witness has already occurred and will continue to occur. And we'll get some more of this with Jacob later on. All right. And again, Jacob makes a vow. He sort of tries to get a deal out of God, right? I mean, look at that. He says in verse 20, if you'll be with me, if you'll keep me in the way that I go, if you give me bread, food, if you give me clothing so that I come back home safely, you can be my God. And I tell you what, I'll sweeten the deal. I'll even give you 1/10 of whatever I have. So we have to watch that whole sense of trying to bargain with God, to try and barter with God, that will show up in there a lot. Okay. What is our time? We should have time to do some of this. So let's go ahead and take 29, 1 through 14. Kind of a fun story.
Then Jacob continued on his journey and came to the land of the eastern peoples. There he saw a well in the open country with 3 flocks of sheep lying near it because the flocks were watered from the well. The stone over the mouth of the well was large. When all the flocks were gathered there, the shepherds would roll the stone away from the well's mouth and water the sheep. Then they would return the stone to its place over the mouth of the well. Jacob asked the shepherds, my brothers, where are you from? We're from Haran, they replied. He said to them, do you know Laban, Nahor's grandson? Yes, we know him, they answered. Then Jacob asked them, "Is he well?" "Yes, he is," they said, "and here comes his daughter Rachel with the sheep." "Look," he said, "the sun is still high. It is not time for the flocks to be gathered. Water the sheep and take them back to pasture." "We can't," they replied, "until all the flocks are gathered and the stone has been rolled away from the mouth of the well. Then we will water the sheep." While he was still talking with them, Rachel came with her father's sheep, for she was a shepherd. When Jacob saw Rachel's daughter of his uncle Laban and Laban's sheep, he went over and rolled the stone away from the mouth of the well and watered his uncle's sheep. Then Jacob kissed Rachel and began to weep aloud. He had told Rachel that he was the relative of her father and the son of Rebekah, so she ran and told her father. As soon as Laban heard the news about Jacob, his sister's son, he hurried to meet him. He embraced him and kissed him and brought him to his home. And there Jacob told him all these things. Then Laban said to him, "You are my own flesh and blood."
Yep, it stays there for how long? A month, right? Well, keep going. Finish off the chapter.
After Jacob had stayed with him for a whole month, Laban said to him, "Just because you are a relative of mine, should you work for me for nothing? Tell me what your wages should be." Now Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the older was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. Leah had weak eyes, but Rachel had a lovely figure and was beautiful. Jacob was in love with Rachel and said, "I will work for you 7 years in return for your promise for your younger daughter Rachel." Laban said, "It's better that I give her to you than to some other man. Stay here with me." So Jacob served 7 years to get Rachel, but they seemed only like a few days because of his love for her. Then Jacob said to Laban, "Give me my wife. My time is complete and I want to make love to her." So Laban brought together all the people of the place and gave a feast. But when evening came, he took his daughter Leah and brought her to Jacob, and Jacob made love to her. Then Laban gave his servant Zilpah to his daughter as her attendant. When morning came, there was Leah. So Jacob said to Laban, "What is this you have done to me? I served you for Rachel, didn't I? Why have you deceived me?" Laban replied, "It is not our custom here to give the younger daughter in marriage before the older one. Finish this daughter's bridal week. Then we will give you the younger one also in return for another 7 years of work." And Jacob did so. He finished the week with Leah, and then Laban gave him his daughter Rachel to be his wife. Laban gave his servant Bilhah to his daughter Rachel as her attendant. Jacob made love to Rachel also, and his love for Rachel was greater than his love for Leah, and he worked for Laban another 7 years.
Yep, finish off.
Oh. When the Lord saw that Leah was not loved, he enabled her to conceive, but Rachel remained childless. Leah became pregnant and gave birth to a son. She named him Reuben, for she said, "It is because the Lord has seen my misery. Surely my husband will love me now." She conceived again, and when she gave birth to a son, she said, "Because the Lord heard that I am not loved, he gave me this one too." So she named him Simeon. When again she conceived, and when she gave birth to a son, she said, "Now at last my husband will become attached to me because I have borne him 3 sons." So he was named Levi. She conceived again, and when she gave birth to a son, she said, "This time I will praise the Lord." So she named him Judah. Then she stopped having children.
Okay, so what's the right way to say it? Again, I don't want to speak ill of our efforts in Sunday school, but this is not a kid's story. Right? And yet we try to teach these stories to our children, and perhaps rightly so, but we sort of know that the stories aren't very savory, right? They're not rated G, if you want to use movie terminology. Most of them are PG and some of them are R, and occasionally you almost get some X-rated stuff in here. And so I think it's something that sometimes because of that is inherent with some of the what I just sort of describe in my own life as my simplified Sunday school faith, because you have to kind of wash it up and clean it up in order to make it suitable for young ears. But then when you take these stories and you start building other foundations on them, they're not complete, right? Does that make sense? So it's just one of the challenges. But what do we have going on here? Jacob is sent off to go find a wife back with his own kindred. He finds his uncle and wants to marry the one daughter. And your translation may be a little different than what you heard read. Verse 17, some translations will say Leah's eyes were weak. Some translations will say Leah's eyes were lovely, right? And then there's usually a footnote in there that says not quite exactly sure how to word it or how to translate it. It's a challenging thing. But Leah's eyes were weak. We would render that colloquially as she's not much to look at. Or Leah's eyes were lovely we would probably render that in today's sense of saying, well, she has a great personality. Usually when you say someone has a great personality, you're sort of not saying that they're not necessarily delightful to look at, right? Now, that's Leah. Rachel, woo, right? You've seen some of those commercials on TV. Woo,
Yeah.
I mean, this is going to make even the statues sort of take note of that. And so Jacob says to his uncle, who says, you really shouldn't work for me for free. What would you like to be paid? He says, oh, I would love to marry your daughter, Rachel. And Jacob says, cool. Or Laban says, I like that. We can do that. I'd rather have her married off to a relative than married off to some stranger, kind of a thing. But then the trickster gets tricked, right? And don't try to get too much figuring out why, how he would go into the tent to begin his marital relationship with his new wife and not know the one from you just don't go there, right? But what happens is in the darkness, not sure what's going on, but come the light of the next day, it isn't the daughter he asked for. And when he goes up to his father-in-law, talk about starting a great relationship with your father-in-law. When he goes up to father, says, what in the world, is going on here? He says, well, here we don't do it that way. We don't marry the younger before we marry the older. But if you still want to marry the younger, it's worked for me another 7 years. So the cheater gets cheated. And it's lovely, right? This whole sense, verse 20 says, Jacob agreed to serve for 7 years to marry Rachel. And because of his love for her, it seemed like just a few days, that's kind of nice. But in order to marry daughter number 2, which is the one he really wanted to marry, he has to complete what is sometimes described as the marriage week, right? What's the whole understanding of one of the primary purposes of marriage is to bear children and to be fruitful and multiply. That whole sense that goes all the way back to the earlier chapters. And so after spending a week with his new wife, who he didn't want, he will get now to spend time with the wife that he does want. With me so far?
But she can't have kids.
Yeah, we're going to get another story of another one of the patriarchs, the wives not being able to have kids. That theme plays out a lot in the Bible story. And so much so, and probably, I'm just rambling at this point, but probably may even be part of the reason that today still, when people can't have children, that's almost an impossibly painful reality, right? If a husband and wife marry and they can't have kids, and they want kids, that's a real kind of a heart tugger still today in our culture. And perhaps also still today, the sense that somehow God is doing something responsible for that, right? And why wouldn't you draw that kind of conclusion when you come across these stories? But then what's fascinating is this favoritism, whatever you want to call it, the fact that Jacob loves one wife and not the other. God makes it so that the unloved wife can have children and the loved wife cannot. And here I'll flip you back quick to our picture, right? And unfortunately, I don't know why those controls show there. But so here you have the Leah sons. You get Reuben and Simeon and Levi and Judah, those first four. And then it simply says she stopped bearing children. But you can tell when you look at the list, wait a minute, there's 3 more kids still coming. So we know the story isn't over yet. That's where we pick up in chapter 30. I'll read. When Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, she envied her sister and said to Jacob, give me children or I shall die. Jacob became very angry with Rachel and said, am I in the place of God who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb? Then she said to him, here is my maid Bilhah, go into her, that she may bear upon my knees, and that I too may have children through her. Sound familiar? Now we're going back to, I will just use Sarah rather than Sarah, but now we're going back to Sarah and Hagar. And this practice of if the matriarch in the house cannot have children, she can offer up one of her servants to provide children in her stead. And so you have Bilhah. And so Jacob does the same thing with her, and she has a couple of sons. So you come over here to Rachel in our picture, and you go Bilhah, and we're going to get Dan and Naphtali. Okay? Well, Leah. There's more than one can play that game, right? So Leah in verse 9 saw that she stopped bearing children. So she offers her handmaid. And so now we'll go to Zilpah and we'll get Gad and Asher. So we're going to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 sons. And in the midst of this story, Reuben, who's the oldest of Leah's children, comes across some mandrakes, right? Which would be aphrodisiac kind of things, and brings them in. They're rare to find. And Rachel says, well, I'd like some of those. And she says, yeah, you want to steal? You've already stole my husband. Now you want to steal my love potion, right? And they make a deal, right? This is just amazing to me. I don't know. Rachel says in verse 15, I'll read. She said to her, is it a small matter that you've taken away my husband? Would you take away my son's mandrakes also? Rachel said, then he may lie with you tonight for your son's mandrakes. So they're making deals. So when Jacob comes in from the field, verse 16, Leah goes to meet him and says, you must come to me tonight, for I've hired you with my son's mandrakes. Okay. So he goes, and now she has Issachar. And his name has to do with something about hiring. And again, she has another son, and this is Zebulun. And then verse 21, which is, has a little bite to it. Afterwards, she bore a daughter and named her Dinah, which is sort of the Bible's way of saying she's done having kids. And finally, verse 22, God remembered Rachel, heeded her, opened her womb. She conceived and bore a son, saying, God has taken away my reproach. She named him Joseph, saying, may the Lord add to me another son. So in some ways you can kind of joke that Joseph means you're a good start, but I want more. And this is where then the story begins to take yet another turn, because here's where Jacob says, I need to go back home. And Laban, and so his father-in-law, they start arguing and debating, and how's this going to happen? Our wealth has intermingled. How are we going to agree to some sort of an agreement? So Jacob in verse 31 says, well, tell you what, from now on, let me take every speckled, spotted, and black lamb, the ones that aren't pure white, and let me take those, let those be my wages. And that way, in case you ever wonder, am I cheating you? You can just look at my flock. And if you see any lambs that don't fit the animals that don't fit this category, it's going to be visibly easy to see. And Laban says, good, sounds like a deal. And then what does he do? He goes ahead and gets rid of all the animals that look like that. And so then Jacob does this little trick of taking some wood and striping it up and putting it in front of the favorable animals that he wants to bear strong, and whenever the unfavorable animals are there. And so then you get this whole story of, again, the cheater finding another way to work his way through. All right.
You think God doesn't have a humor?
Yeah, I mean that too. It is. And of course, this floats down into the family tree, because chapter 31 begins with referencing how Jacob is hearing his the others in Laban's household, right? Saying, so in other words, his brothers-in-law saying, Jacob's cheating us, and realizes at this point it's not going to work. And of course, God in verse 3 of chapter 31 says, time to go home. And they go ahead and they get everything together, but it's in the midst of this that Rachel steals the household gods of her father. So remember, the household gods, these are not necessarily God worshipers all the time. And the household gods would often be a sign of fertility, or a sign of wealth, or a sign of protection, that they would think about. And so they're going to go and do that, right? And when Laban and his sons are shearing the sheep, it's an ideal time. It's going to take them a while to do that. So that's when Jacob decides, we're getting out of here. And they go, they're told about it. Interestingly enough, verse 22 of chapter 31 says this happened when? On the third day. We're going to get that. On the third day. On the third day. And it took 7 days to catch up, and they get there, and it's not necessarily going to be a happy meeting, right? Laban says, what is this are you doing, And we hear about this argument. I'm kind of paraphrasing, obviously, verse 28. Why did you not permit me to kiss my sons and my daughters? What you've done is foolish. It's in my power to harm you, but God appeared to him the night before he caught up and said, don't do anything bad to him. But then he says, verse 30, even though you had to go, why did you steal my gods? And Jacob says, well, I left because I was afraid that you'd take them all away from me. Verse 32, anyone with whom you find your gods shall not live. And some of the rabbis have postulated, because you may know, that Rachel is pregnant with Benjamin and she'll die giving birth. And so even though Laban goes searching through all the tents and doesn't find the gods, and Rachel has them, sticks them in a camel bag, sits down on the bag and says, I really can't get up right now because it's kind of that monthly time. So they don't search under her, but they search everywhere else. They don't find anything. This will later find out that she has them. And it is interesting that Jacob's curse will fall upon his beloved wife. So that some of the rabbis will point that out as kind of an interesting part of it. But they go and they do make peace. And somebody read 43 through the end of the chapter. This is in chapter 31.
Then Laban answered and said to Jacob, the daughters are my daughters, the children are my children, the flocks are my flocks, and all that you see is mine. But what can I do today about these daughters of mine, or about their children whom they have borne? Come now, let us make a covenant, you and I, and let it be a witness between you and me. So Jacob took a stone and set it up as a pillar. And Jacob said to his kinfolk, gather stones, and they took stones and made a heap, and they ate there by the heap. Laban called it J, but Jacob called it G. Laban said, this heap is a witness between you and me today. Therefore he called it G, and the pillar Mizpah, for he said, the Lord watched between you and me when we are absent one from the other. If you ill-treat my daughters, or if you take wives in addition to my daughters, though no one else is with me, remember that God is witness between you and me. Then Laban said to Jacob, see this heap and see the pillar which I have set between you and me. This heap is a witness, and the pillar is a witness that I will not pass beyond this heap to you, and you will not pass beyond this heap and this pillar to me for harm. May the God of Abraham and the God of Nahor, the God of their father, judge between us. So Jacob swore by the fear of his father Isaac, and Jacob offered a sacrifice on the height and called his kinfolk to eat bread. And they ate bread and tarried all night in the hill country. Early in the morning, Laban rose up and kissed his grandchildren and his daughters and blessed them. Then he departed and returned home.
Thank you. So here then is another pile of stones and a stone that stood up that serves as a witness, that serves as some sort of way of notifying, right? If you know anything about backpackers, if they're going in groups, will sometimes set up stones to mark trails. So it's not just in that context, but there's this covenant, there's this arrangement that's made that they're gonna not fight against each other, right? So that's kind of interesting. The first part of chapter 32, we get another place named Mahanaim, and now it's time to face the music with Esau. And so he sends off that, he's going to be coming, and he's because he knows the last contact he had with his brother was, I'm going to kill you, kind of a thing. And so he breaks his family up in groups and starts sending them ahead. And again, that favoritism keeps showing up, right? Because he sends first off the wives that are the handmaids and their kids. And then he sends off Leah's, and finally, he's hoping that if Esau comes to slaughter, by the time he gets, he'll run out of stomach for slaughtering. And so perhaps Rachel and Joseph will be okay. Again, this is like, it's not very nice stuff in here. But what we have at the end, back half, I guess you could say, of chapter 32 is Jacob wrestling, right? And here's where the name. So it's 22 through the end of the chapter. Somebody read.
The same night he got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 maids, and his 11 children, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream, and likewise everything that he had. Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he struck him on the hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, let me go, for the day is breaking. But Jacob said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. So he said to him, what is your name? And he said, Jacob. Then the man said, you shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, For you have striven with God and with humans and have prevailed. Then Jacob asked him, please tell me your name. But he said, why is it that you ask my name? And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, for I have seen God face to face, and yet my life is preserved. The sun rose upon him as he passed Peniel, limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the Israelites do not eat the thigh muscle that is on the hip socket, because he struck Jacob on the hip socket at the thigh muscle.
So verse 32 again is another one of those verses that tells us these are being written later, right? So the story's being related, and EL is shortened for Hebrew for God. And so that's why you'll get Israel, Peniel, Bethel. So El is a God word. So here Jacob's name changed to Israel, and so sometimes he'll be Jacob, sometimes he'll be Israel, but that's why these children here from Ephraim or Joseph, Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Gad, Asher, all of their children will be referred to as the Israelites. Okay. So that's where that comes from. But you've got this Jacob wrestling here, just described with a man, sometimes understood as an angel, but this idea that he's a tough old guy who hangs in there. And so the cheater, even though he's a cheater, gets a new name, just like Abraham got a new name, a sign of something to come. But so Israel means, striving with God, or something like God strives, as you see probably in a footnote. And then Jacob and Esau, and what was in his fear, thinking was going to be this deadly encounter, is actually one of great forgiveness. And Esau, who's sort of a belly brain and shown to be, not thinking about stuff or whatever, is here the one who's described as being a person of great care and compassion, right? He forgives his brother. They weep, they cry, right? Jacob pleads, let me pay you something. But they make peace. They make peace. Chapter 34, we have no way to turn chapter 34 into a Sunday school lesson. And so it may not have been a story you were familiar with before. But Dinah, the one and only daughter who's named, is raped. And the man who raped her, sometimes in the Bible, we'll see this with one of David's sons who rapes his half-sister. Sometimes after the rape, there's the despisal for the man despises the woman he raped. But in this instance, the one who forced her to have sex with him still wants to have her and begs and pleads with his father that he would have her. And so they go and ask, and two of her brothers said, well, we kind of have this deal here that we're circumcised, you're not, and we don't give our sisters to uncircumcised people. So if you and your whole village would consent to be circumcised, okay, you can marry our sister. But they did this not with honesty. They did this thinking, okay, they're going to do this. They're going to be so hurting that we can go in and wipe them out. And that's exactly what they do. And so it's kind of a nasty story. And Jacob himself says, what have you done, right? Verse 30 of chapter 34, Jacob said to Simeon and Levi, you've brought trouble on me by making me odious to the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites, the Perizzites. My numbers are few. If they gather together against me and attack me, I shall be destroyed, both I and my household. But they said, should our sister be treated like a whore? And the story just kind of stops. So it's this one little episode of that. But Jacob goes back to Bethel. Bethel means the house of God. And that's where that stone was. And this is kind of both interesting and sad. Somebody 35, 1 through 15.
God said to Jacob, arise, go to Bethel and settle there, make an altar there to the God who appeared to you when you fled from your brother Esau. So Jacob said to his household and to all who were with him, put away the foreign gods that are among you, and purify yourselves and change your clothes. Then come, let us go up to Bethel, that I may make an altar there to the God who answered me in the day of my distress, and has been with me wherever I have gone. So they gave to Jacob all the foreign gods that they had, and the rings that were in their ears, and Jacob hid them under the oak that was near Shechem. As they journeyed, a terror from God fell upon the cities all around them, so that no one pursued them. Jacob came to Luz, that is Bethel, which is in the land of Canaan, he and all the people who were with him, and there he built an altar and called the place El Bethel, because it was there that God had revealed himself to him when he fled from his brother. And Deborah, Rebekah's nurse, died, and she was buried under an oak below Bethel. So it was called Elon Backruth. God appeared to Jacob again when he came from Padam Aram, and he blessed him. God said to him, your name is Jacob. No longer shall you be called Jacob, but Israel shall be your name. So he was called Israel. God said to him, I am God Almighty. Be fruitful and multiply. A nation and a company of nations shall come from you, and the kings shall spring from you. The land I gave to Abraham and Isaac, I will give to you, and I will give the land to your offspring after you. Then God went up with him at the place where he had spoken with him. Jacob set up a pillar in the place where he had spoken with him, a pillar of stone, and he poured out a drink of offering on it and poured oil on it. So Jacob called the place where God had spoken with him Bethel.
Okay, so some of those, the same kinds of themes that we've been seeing, but here is God again repeating the promises, a stone being set up as a place, an altar being raised. And it's those foreign gods, right? We're going to encounter this a lot, is that the Israelites, what's a fair way to say it? It appears they hedge their bets. They worship God, but then they have these other gods that are there. And so they're really, this will continue to play out in the story. And the problem will get worse in a couple of units. We'll see how the worshiping of the false idols, the false gods, the gods of their neighbors becomes a snare for them, and they won't shake it. Even though the prophets will warn them, stop doing that. Stop doing that. Return to the Lord, right? That whole sense, but they keep hedging their bets. But here's where Jacob would have got those gods that Rachel had stolen. But she wasn't the only one, because it says they, right? It doesn't just say she, but they gave Jacob all the foreign gods and the rings that were in there. So apparently even some of the jewelry would be tied in with these other things that they would worship. Aren't you glad that at least that fad at least is gone now in our world? Yeah, right. So we still have these same kinds of things. And so the last part of chapter 35 talks about now how as they're approaching Ephrath is Bethlehem. As they're approaching Bethlehem, Ephrath, Rachel goes into child labor and she doesn't make it. And she names the son Ben-Oni, which means son of my sorrow. But the father, Jacob, renames him Benjamin, and son of the south, or the son of my right hand. And that's the last of the 12 is born on the way home. And of course, verse 22 says he lived in the land. Here he's called Israel. And that's getting messy again, because Reuben goes and has sex with one of his father's women. And so Reuben's, we're gonna get some trouble there, but now you have the sons named, right? In verses 22 and 23, Jacob's 12 sons, here they are. And then now you're getting this transition because Isaac's gonna die. Isaac's been alive throughout this whole thing, but we don't hear very much about his life. But Jacob and Esau will bury their father, and he's buried in that cave. And then we hear about Esau's descendants a little bit in chapter 36. And then suddenly we transition now to Joseph. So we were Abraham, then Isaac, then Jacob, then now much of the story is going to focus on Joseph. And we won't spend a lot of time reading these because these are very well-known stories, and we don't have to clean them up quite as much to tell them to us. But you know about Joseph and his dreams. So somehow early on, he's having these dreams, and they're dreams in which he will rise to a high position, higher above anybody else in his family. And of course, this causes great enmity amongst the siblings, because we all probably grew up hearing about a coat of many colors, right? Newer translations will say a coat of long sleeves. It's some sort of special garment. And remember, Joseph is the first son of the favored wife. So you get some of that family animosity in there. And his brothers eventually, they're done with it, right? And they sell him into slavery. So that's what's happening in chapter 37. We have a little interlude here with Judah and Tamar. And besides the unsavoriness of the story, it's a reminder that it's through Judah that we will get down to David, that we'll get down to Jesus. So it is worth noting, right? Because Judah gets a wife for his son. She's a Canaanite wife. He marries a Canaanite, and he has 3 sons. And you've got Onan, and Shelah. And he gets his wife a son, Tamar, but we're told, and not any specifics, simply in verse 7, that was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and so he's terminated. And we have no details about it. And then he says to his other son, Onan, you now need to raise up descendants for your deceased brother. This is what's called a Levirate marriage. And we actually don't read about it till we get to Leviticus. So it's interesting, some of the patterns that are being shared already. But he's supposed to go in and get Tamar pregnant so that his brother's family line doesn't end. But he doesn't want to do that. So every time they're intimate, he pulls out before, and the semen spilled on the ground. So he's killed. It's not a Sunday school story. Right? It's hardly a Crossways story. I mean, this is bad, right? And so he's put to death. And then Judah says to the daughter-in-law, okay, Shelah's not old enough to marry you yet, so you just kind of hang in there until Shelah's old enough, and then he'll commit the act of a brother so that we don't lose the family tree here. Well, he didn't stay true to his word. So Tamar goes back home, lives with her father as a widow, and then over the course of time, Judah's wife dies, and Tamar hears about this, already knows that that 3rd son is of age and should be given her as her husband, so she's going to pull a fast one on her father-in-law. And she disguises herself as a prostitute and goes to the places where prostitutes can meet men on the road. And when Judah comes by, he's apparently grieving the loss of his wife. I mean, this is right. This is the Bible. We do not read, you do know that's why some of the stories, some of the passages in the Bible, we do not read in worship. This is not suitable for worship. But we look at it because it's in there. And so what happens is she tricks her father-in-law into having sex with her, and she becomes pregnant. And he wants to pay her, but he doesn't have the money along with him because he wasn't thinking about doing this. It was one of those spur of the moment decisions, guys. Watch out for the spur of the moment decisions, right? And so she gets from him his staff and his cord, his signet ring, and that's going to be kind of the proof that he's going to pay her. And so his buddy goes and gets the animal that they were going to pay her with, and they get there and she's not there. And they ask about her, she's not there. Nobody knows about her. We don't know prostitutes here. That happens in the next town over or whatever. They don't exactly say it that way. So lo and behold, she goes back home, gets to the point where she can't hide her pregnancy anymore. And Judah hears about it and says, finally I can get rid of this woman. Because they're going to kill her for being unfaithful. And when she comes out and it confronts her, he says, we're going to kill you. She says, well, that's fine. I just want you to know these things belong to the Father. And he looks at him and they're his. And he actually owns up to it, which is kind of interesting. And Judah, by the way, means praise God. It's messy, right? But she is the one then through whom she's going to have, when her time, this is verse 27, she's going to have children. She has twins. And this is the one where one sticks its hand out, but isn't quite out yet and goes, but they got a little cord, he pulls his hand back in, the other one comes out first. So anyway, it's just kind of an interesting story, but you've got Perez and Zerah. And we're going to follow the storyline. Perez, yeah. Yep. So that story's just kind of there. It's like, what is that story for? And yet it's interesting. This will show up in Jesus's genealogy. And so, at least for me, I think about these things and say, God's not scared of messy situations. And we can get ourselves and do all sorts of dumb, foolish, evil, wicked, hurtful, hateful things. But that doesn't mean that we're done with God. So, I mean, that's kind of the hope behind this. But real quickly, just using the heading, now you know that Joseph is sold into slavery in Egypt to Potiphar, and he does such a great job that he is elevated into Potiphar's house as being, kind of his right-hand man, we would sort of say in our world. And it's in the midst of this that Potiphar's wife apparently takes a fancy for Joseph and offers herself to him on numerous occasions. He declines, but then one day he's in the house and there's nobody else around except her, and she starts to become insistent, and he just says, I'm out of here, but somehow, some way, part of his clothing are left behind, and now she accuses him of attempting to rape her. And that's when he's thrown into jail. Now, the text doesn't specifically say this, but in verse 19, it says, when his master heard the words that his wife spoke to him, this is the way your servant treated me, he became enraged. And he took him and put him in prison where the king's prisoners were confined. And I haven't done enough study to validate this, but I wonder I wonder why wasn't Joseph just summarily put to death right then and there? Because maybe Potiphar wasn't angry at Joseph, he was angry at his wife. I don't know. Doesn't say it, but clearly it would have been within his right to kill him for that. But it's interesting, right? So Joseph goes to jail. And yet even in jail, it says verse 20, the Lord was with Joseph, showed him steadfast love, gave him favor in the sight of the jailer. And so now Joseph rises to however you can rise in jail. And then comes the dreams, right, in chapter 40. And we do take most of these stories and turn them into Sunday school accounts, right? And so we know about the two of Pharaoh's servants, right, his baker and his butler, who do something to make Pharaoh angry, and so they're put in jail. And while they're in jail, they have dreams, and they have these dreams about the cupbearer, the butler. He has a vine, and there's these branches, and out come blossoms, and they turn into grapes. And I took the grapes, turned them into wine, and gave them to Pharaoh. And Joseph says, oh, that's God telling you in 3 days, you're going to get your job back. And the baker, when he hears this, thinks, oh, cool, I'm going to tell him my dream. And he tells him about how he had the basket that was eaten up, and Joseph said, well, it's certainly for you. It's 3 days, you're going to die. The birds are going to poke out your eyes and do all these sorts of nasty things, right? And that's exactly what happens. And in the account of this, Joseph says to the butler, remember me, right? I'm here unjustly. Well, he forgets. And the story goes on into chapter 41 with Pharaoh having these dreams, right? And there are two different kinds of dreams. You've got the cows, the ugly cows, the skinny cows. You've got the fat, beautiful cows. And they come up and they eat up the fat ones, and they don't even look like anything has happened to them. The same thing gets repeated with wonderful heads of grain. There's 7 wonderful heads of grain, and there's 7 withered heads of grain, and the withered ones eat up, and this is troubling Pharaoh. And that's when the butler says, I forgot, right? He says, there's this guy who can do it. So what's interesting is they clean Joseph up, right? Verse 14 of chapter 41, Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and he was hurriedly brought out of the dungeon when he had shaved himself and changed his clothes, right? So they got to clean him up to get him to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh tells him his dreams. He says, I hear you're a dream interpreter. He says, well, no, God is the one who interprets dreams, but by God's grace at times I'm told about them. And this is when Joseph explains that these 2 dreams, which are repetitions of the same thing, portend the coming of 7 incredibly abundant years. Will there be more than people can possibly eat? But those will be followed up by 7 horrid years of famine, where the abundant years will be forgotten. And he says, I think what God's telling you is you better find somebody who can help you save up from the abundant years to get you through the lean years. And of course, Pharaoh says, well, who's better at that than you? So here's this rise of Joseph, right? Eventually comes as described by many today as he becomes the prime minister of Egypt. And so he rises to power. He's given a wife, begins to have children. That's where Ephraim and Manasseh come out. And meanwhile, when the famine hits, it's not just in and around Egypt, it's in and around the whole region, right? So in chapter 42, of Jacob learning of the fact that there's grain in Egypt, so he sends his sons down to get some. And you know the story. Joseph recognizes them. They don't recognize him. Part of the deal is that the Israelites would have big beards. Joseph is shaved clean. And so if you've ever seen someone who hasn't had a beard and they have one, you may not recognize. I just bumped into a friend from town that I hadn't seen for years. Big old beard. I had to do a double take to make sure it was really who I thought it was. Or vice versa. If you've had the beard and the beard goes away, and I know this is being recording, but that's what my wife hopes will happen for our son eventually someday, because she misses his face. So Jacob, if you're watching this, you make sure someday shave for your mama, would you please? Then you can start growing it again. But anyway, they don't recognize him. He recognizes them. Of course, there would be interpreters. between the two of them, but he would obviously understand the Hebrew that they would be speaking, but he would be speaking Egyptian. So they come down and there's this little bit of cat and mouse game, right, where he puts their money back into their bags and all of this, finds out about their brother, a lot of that stuff going on. And eventually he wants to see his kid brother. And this is causing Jacob such great trouble, but eventually he gives in, sends him down. The family is reunited. Joseph reveals himself to his brother, and you've got that exchange happening, right? I'm really shortening what's in here. But in chapter 46, this is when the whole family now will transport from Canaan down into Egypt, and particularly in the area of Goshen. There's this reunion between father and son, right? And so all of the sadness, all of the sorrow are kind of soaked up in this. And Jacob describes, this joy of thinking he would never have seen his son again, and now he gets to see his grandchildren. I mean, this is, tremendous power in the story. And then we get in the end of chapter 47 to Jacob's leading towards Jacob's death. We've got the end of that at 47 in chapter 48. You've got the blessings in chapter 49. You have his last words. But look, for example, at verse 49, verses 8 through 12. Somebody read that.
Judah, your brothers shall praise you. Your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's son shall bow down before you. Judah is a lion's whelp from the prey. My son, you have gone up. He crouches down, he stretches out like a lion, like a lioness who dares rouse him up. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until the tribute comes to him, and the obedience of the people is his, binding his foal to the vine, and his donkey's colt to the choice vine. He washes his garments in wine, and his robe in blood of grapes. His eyes are darker than wine, and his teeth whiter than milk.
Okay, so it's a rather long blessing, but you have that idea of a scepter, right? That it's through Judah that the kingship shall come. And so finally, at the end of chapter 49, Joseph dies. And I love Jacob dies. And I love the language about, in verse 29, I am about to be gathered to my people. It's kind of a nice Bible ways of talking about that. But he dies, and then he is buried way back in that burial cave. And the last phrase of chapter 49 is, he was gathered to his people. And of course, there's great weeping, there's great mourning. They embalm him, and kind of give you a little insight into that process, right?
A long time.
Yep, it is a long time. How many days?
30
Or
40. There's that number again, 40 days. So again, we don't always know if the numbers and the days are exact, or if they're just kind of a phrase that it takes a long time to do some embalming. But they bury him, and we have all of that given in the first half of chapter 50. And then we'll spend a little bit of time with these final verses. Somebody read Genesis chapter 50, verses 15 through 21.
When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "What if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him?" So they sent word to Joseph saying, "Your father left these instructions before he died. This is what you are to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brother's sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of your servants of God of your father. When their message came to him, Joseph wept. His brothers then came and threw themselves down before him. We are your slaves, they said. But Joseph said to them, don't be afraid. Am I in place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children. And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them.
So here's this great phrase, right? Am I in the place of God? And so at the end of this very story that has all sorts of wonderful, beautiful things, all sorts of hurtful, ugly things, you have these words that of reconciliation, of forgiveness, right? You intended to harm me. God intended it for good. And this is one of those passages, another one probably even more famous or well known, right? We know that in everything God works for good for those who love him, who are called according to his purposes in Romans chapter 8. This sense that we belong to a God who somehow, some way can bring good even out of ugly, tragic, horrid, hurtful, hateful stuff. And we hold fast to that promise. And Joseph promises that he says, don't be afraid, right? Fear not. Heard that phrase before. You'll hear it many times. I will provide for you. I will provide for your little ones. And then the last few verses are simply about his death and that it kind of sums it up, right? So Joseph remained in Egypt, verse 22, he and his father's household, and Joseph lived 110 years. Now, finally, the ages are creeping down to what we're more useful, right? Or used to. Joseph saw Ephraim's children of the third generation. The children of Machir, son of Manasseh, were also born on Joseph's knees. So how do you summarize a good long life? You get to see your children and your grandchildren, right? And we still measure that, don't we, in some ways? When one generation lives to see one or two or even three generations beyond that. And it ends, Joseph says to his brothers, I'm about to die, but God will surely come to you and bring you up out of this land, to the land that he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. So Joseph made the Israelites swear, saying, when God comes to you, you shall carry my bones from here. And Joseph died, being 110 years old. He was embalmed and placed in a coffin in Egypt. But that's not the end of the story, right? That kind of sets us up. We know that more is coming. But it is, again, kind of an interesting summing up. And you would think Joseph, where he is in the family tree, maybe all his brothers had died. It doesn't really give us a lot of detail about that. But, here it says he's talking to his brothers. So maybe the youngest lived less than the others. But it's this, as we close with Genesis, they are happily settled into Egypt. But there's also the promise that this isn't the location where the story's going to end, right? God will bring you up. And when we get to Exodus, we're going to see how that carries itself forward. Okay. That is the summary that's described on pages 84 and 85 and 86. Page 87, for which there's no picture. If you got a chance to read it, great. If you didn't, read it again. If you didn't read it, read it. If you did read it, you might want to read it again. But here's where we learn about Nuzi and some of the things that they dug up and some of the things that they discovered about what's often referred to as the ancient Near East and how those people had their customs with respect to marriage or with respect to other things. And that's why number one points out things like you could have a wife who's also a sister, right? Or you could have a wife who uses her handmaid to raise up children if she is unable to have children. You could get these kinds of things going, and it just kind of takes you down through several of the examples that we read that at least may not. Look at point number 7, the presence of a few wicked individuals in a community contaminated the entire community. We may not find ourselves necessarily, I'll use the word liking those realities, but at least we know they aren't unique to the narrative that we see in the Bible. It was part of just the way that people thought or acted. Point 5 talks about hospitality and how that hospitality is still in place in the Middle East today. So that's the second half of Genesis. When we come back next time, we're going to look at the greatest event in the Old Testament, which is the Exodus. So let's close with our prayers, and then I will, for those of you who want to stay, because we're at our time here, if you want to stay longer, I'm going to take you through a timeline a little bit. If you've got your timelines along, we'll have an opportunity to look at this some later. Those of you watching this later will you'll catch the timeline perhaps sometime in person, or at one of these subsequent lessons, I will do more timeline on the screen. Okay, so let's go to our prayers here. I'll pop those back up. And I'll scoot past the timeline stuff because I'll come back to this in a minute. But let's do our prayers. That hide for a minute because I think that even shows up in the recording. Lord, make us instruments of your peace. Where there is hatred, let us sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is discord, union. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. O divine Master, grant that we may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive, it is in pardoning that we are pardoned, and it is in dying that we are born to eternal life. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as in heaven. Give us today our daily bread. Forgive us our sins as we forgive those who sin against us. Save us from the time of trial and deliver us from evil. For the kingdom, the power, and the glory are yours, now and forever. So as I'm closing these things out here, notice we're just completed chapter 6. And even though I describe this as an in-depth study, we're still just scratching the surface, right? I mean, there's so much more to go, but if you want to hang around, I will do some timeline stuff if you need to